almost every single practice that people tell you to do, for every person who claimed it was the cause of their success, there's 1,000 people who will never be able to have a voice. There's 1,000 people who tried exactly that practice and failed to achieve the result. So it's not necessarily a causation. Maybe it's a correlation. Maybe it's a coincidence. And so we're not good at being critical thinkers. And I think that's a really important thing, is to just understand that distinction between causation, correlation, and coincidence. And we tend not to do that. And that leads us then to context, which is there's never a one-size-fits-all strategy. Anybody who tells you, go do this, I would immediately be skeptical of what they say.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Doing creative work can be kind of lonely, and that's why we built the Unmistakable Listener Tribe. The tribe is a community for professionals to connect and support each other. Everything is designed to help you grow your business and share what's working and what isn't. And that's true whether you're a business owner or an artist. You'll get access to feedback, live conversations with guests, and so much more. By joining the tribe, you become part of a community of creators who all support each other, and it's completely free. Hopefully I'll see you there. Visit unmistakablecreative.com/tribe to join. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Steve, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, fantastic to be here. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was mentioning to you before we hit record, I came across your work inside of Oliver Burkeman's book, The Antidote, who was a former guest here, actually our first guest this year. And when I saw the whole idea of goal-free living, I thought, oh my God, this flies in the face of every idea in personal development that I've ever come across. I have to talk to this guy. But before we get into all of that, I want to start by asking you, what is one of the most important things that you learned from one or both of your parents that have influenced and shaped who you've become and what you've ended up doing with your life?
Wow. I think one of the things which has been extremely influential is my dad always said everything happens for a reason. And he didn't mean that in some kind of mystical way, like there's a plan in the universe. It was really more just a lens. If whatever happens to you doesn't seem like it's good, well, let's look for the silver lining in it. Because if you take the time to look for it, then you find what's good. And I've found that actually has worked really well for me throughout my life. Is anytime I have a setback, I just try to look for the silver lining in everything.
Yeah. So, okay, that's fascinating. So one is I wonder how that has shaped, influences and actions in your life and moments in your life where, you've had bad things happen because, the reality is bad things happen to good people all the time. That's just part of life. But the other thing I appreciate that you said was that he didn't say it as some sort of mystical new age bullshit nonsense. Like he just said it in a very practical way. So how do you separate the sort of mystical new age version of that from the practical real version of that? Because I think that that's a trap that people get stuck in, and it just gives them an excuse to sit on their ass.
Well, I think that the key with everything is action. So I don't think, I'm not a believer that you just sort of visualize something and everything is going to manifest itself. I think you could visualize something and then you need to take action. So I really do believe that life becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy just because at some level, whether it's a subconscious level or not, we start taking actions, we start having conversations, we start doing things that are a little different based on those beliefs that we have. And so that's been my strong belief, is that if we strongly believe something, it's not that the world is going to conspire to give it to us, but we're going to be taking the action. If we get off of our butts, every action we take is going to move us in that direction. So I remember one time I really wanted to have a TV show. Now it never actually materialized, but I got really close. I was in the pitching room of some of the biggest networks. And that only came about because people would say, what are you doing? It's like, well, I'm working on this. And someday I'll have a TV show. And I just threw that out as just a little passing comment, but just throwing that out there, all of a sudden people said, oh, well, I know this person, they're a producer, or this person. And so I find even just small, subtle changes like that can make a huge, huge impact on the direction you take your life.
Yeah. Well, so, you said that you look for the silver lining in everything. Take me to an experience, either, growing up, or take me to several that, something that was really bad in the moment ended up being good in the long run. Because I think that what I've realized is that we only recognize that something good happened or something bad happened for a reason in retrospect. But in the moment, it's the worst thing in the world because it's happening to us at this exact moment.
Well, I think growing up, I mean, for me, I was a scrawny, nerdy kid. I was in the math club. I was terrible at sports. I mean, I remembered I'd be like the very last kid to be picked for the kickball team. I mean, I was just terrible. I really was. But what it did was, the downside of being a bad athlete is that I was like, okay, well, if that's not my strength, if that's not what I'm going to be great at, what will I excel at? And so I put myself into academics. I did, join the math club. I did get actively involved. And I also got actively involved in music, which to me was the most life-changing thing. So I got involved in my jazz band, and the jazz band in high school and elementary school and everything else was just, it was transformational for my life because first of all, it gave me confidence, but also it gave me a love of the stage. I was in front of thousands of people from the time I was relatively young. And, now that they're all virtual at the moment, but now that I give speeches for a living, or part of my business is giving speeches in front of very large audiences, I got so comfortable with that. So when I think about, okay, well, I wasn't great at sports, but it turned me on to other activities that really have had a huge impact on my life.
Okay, so I it's funny because we must have such a parallel story. I played the tuba for 9 years, and same story. Got the shit kicked out of me in a football field and in seventh grade in Texas, where there are seventh graders the size of grown men. So I wonder, what instruments did you play?
Well, I got to say, I was at least a little cooler than the tuba.
Yeah, I mean, the tuba is not very cool. Like, let's be honest.
I was a sax player, so at least I had that going for me. But I was also a bassoon player in orchestras, which was not exactly the coolest thing. I was there with my bow tie playing bassoon, but the sax was really my favorite instrument.
Yeah. Well, what did you learn from the experience of learning how to play an instrument and becoming good enough at it? Because, I realized like the most formative experience of my entire high school career was being in band, because I made all-state band 3 years in a row. And I think the thing that it taught me more than anything else was the power of practicing something and developing skills. It's something you have no natural aptitude for. So I wonder, what did you learn from your own experiences of band outside of sort of the ability to stand on stage? Because I can relate to that too. Like, I don't get nervous in front of an audience. It's just one of those things that was like, I'm a performer, so this is just natural. But what did you learn that you applied to your life going forward?
Well, first, if people don't know, Allstate's a big deal. So that means you are really, really good. So I just want to say kudos to that. For me, what it was is, first of all, being uber shy. It was at least a chance for me to build some social skills, which were very important to me. So there was that aspect. And it was really interesting too. You talked about the discipline. Well, I'm not really very good at discipline, but I remember what happened was, my parents, would say to me, like when I think it was, 4th or 5th grade, somewhere around, maybe it was 3rd grade. I started playing very early, and my parents were like, look, we are happy. I think I started off playing in group lessons, taking group lessons with a whole bunch of people. They said, look, if you really want to get good, you're going to need private lessons. But if you're going to do private lessons, which is going to cost us money, you need to promise us you're going to practice at least 3 times a week. And my response was, no way. So I didn't take private lessons for a while, but I practiced 7 days a week for hours a day. And at some point it was like, okay, clearly I'm going to do it. So I'm going to stop fighting. So I learned something about myself, which is I don't like being told what to do. I like being able to have sort of my freedom. And that to me, I don't know how that actually influenced me, but it was just a very, very interesting insight to have at a young age, to recognize I don't want to be controlled, but I will, do things that I would have done anyway. And that's sort of the crazy thing.
So this is always fascinating to me is I wonder why you think that certain people have moments of insight like that at such a young age versus the people who don't. Because I think that, when I look back at college, when I look back at most of these experiences, I only realized that, I got profound lessons from them, in retrospect. I didn't see what I was getting at the time.
I'm not sure I was that smart to get it at the time. It really is just sort of reflecting back in some cases. But I do know, it comes back to something you were saying earlier on is all these decisions, whether we learn them at a conscious level or a subconscious level, do influence the actions, the decisions, the conversations we have, and the direction we take with our life. And so I do think those experiences, whether it's and I too got beat up, so you put all those different experiences together and they influence us and move us in a direction. And then I guess to me, the big question is always how much of the direction of our life was by design or by default?
Yeah.
And I think what happens is in a lot of cases, something happened to us, therefore we go in a direction which might not be healthy for us, as opposed to saying, this happened to me. Okay, that was interesting. What can I do that's actually going to be a positive thing in my life? Because I guess if you get beat up, maybe your response is join a gang or something. I don't know. I mean, there's, I'm sure, a lot of different ways people could go. But fortunately, and that was my parents' influence and my friends, my friends were all nerds. And so all those different decisions moving down a particular path.
Subscribe to Ready to Trade, a new 2-part series exploring the opportunities in the UK's e-commerce and healthcare sectors with business leaders in each landscape.
In the UK, we have the infrastructure, we have the connectivity, we also have the culture.
Digital is the way forward, there's no doubt, and your business needs to embrace that opportunity.
Ready to Trade is available to download and is produced by Reuters Plus in partnership with the UK's Department for International Trade.
I like a bed that's really firm.
I need something a little softer than that.
Rest easy. With the Sleep Number 360 smart bed, you can both adjust your comfort with your Sleep Number setting.
Can it really help me fall asleep faster?
Yes, by gently warming your feet.
Okay, but can it help keep us asleep?
It senses your movements and automatically adjusts to keep you effortlessly comfortable. Sleep Number, proven quality sleep is life-changing sleep. Don't miss our President's Day weekend special. Save 50% on the Sleep Number 360 limited edition smart bed. Plus special financing and free premium delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. Special financing subject to credit approval. Minimum monthly payments required. See store for details.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned the sort of confidence thing that comes from that, because I very distinctly remember my 9th grade band director telling me, the first time I sort of ran into all the kids who made all-state band, there was a trumpet player who lived across town in our crosstown, rival, and he went to our crosstown rival high school. And I was kind of, annoyed by how arrogant he seemed about his abilities. And, the funny thing was my band director said, I need to tell you this, but that is the attitude that you're going to find in every one of these people. They don't believe that they're bad. They believe they're good, and they believe that they're here to make all-state band, and it's inevitable. And that, sort of it raises a question about this confidence idea. So Chris Sacca, the venture capitalist, when he has been interviewed, there's one thing that he will say over and over about the people that he invests in as founders, and it's that they believe that their success is inevitable. And I wonder if you think that belief can be developed, and if so, how?
Wow, it's a interesting question, and I'm not really sure. I mean, I struggle still with, call it the imposter syndrome, but it's for me, but here's I guess the thing is, if people are really honest with themselves, because I've had a conversation, I've been studying the imposter syndrome now for over 20 years, and I mean, it's become vogue now, but I've been going back to the early days of some of this. I know it first came out in the 70s, but one of the things that I've talked to a lot of people, like household names of people that are business icons, some of the most influential people in the world. And I would ask them, do you have the imposter syndrome? And they said, absolutely. I can't believe every day that people think I'm as great as they think I am. And and the thing with the imposter syndrome is it's not about a lack of confidence. It's the gap. It's the gap between how others see you and how you see yourself. And the more successful you become, well, what happens in some cases is the speed at which the outside world starts buying into who you are versus the speed at which you buy internally gets out of whack. And the bigger the gap between how the world sees you and how you see yourself, that's the imposter syndrome. That's where I struggle. I know I do good work. I know that I make a huge impact in the world. I know, I will be successful at things. But then when I hear people say some things about me, I'm like, it doesn't sound like it's me.
Yeah. Well, I think I may have told this story before. I remember we had a vendor who was looking at translating our content into different languages using an AI tool. And she heard a few episodes and she was like, you must be the most self-actualized person in the world. I was like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I'm like, I do this work because I'm probably one of the most fucked up people you'll ever meet. Like it's all of this is an attempt to solve my own issues. I'm far from that self-actualized. One thing I wonder is, you mentioned your parents. What did they do for work, and what did they tell you about making your way in the world?
So my mother decided she was interior, went to school originally for interior design, interior decorating. I know there's a distinction between the two, and I probably got it wrong, but she was getting a degree in that, and then she had me and decided to, take care of me. But what she's done throughout pretty much her entire life, which I've always loved and I've just found so incredible, is that although she's not really had a job, but she's done volunteer work for as long as I can remember, whether it's going to the VA hospital and working with patients there, or going to retirement communities and running activity centers. And, I love how she really, I just see how her creativity and just her passion for those types of things is something that's always inspired me. And then my father, he, was interesting. My father, basically worked pretty much for the same company his entire life. I mean, out of college, worked for a company, stayed there, eventually left the company shortly after, worked for another company, and that company was bought by the original company, or the company went to bought his original company. So he was with the same company pretty much entire business career. And when I look at what I've done, it's almost like in some respects the antithesis of that, because I went right out of college into consulting, which meant that I wasn't in an office. I was on the road 100% of the time. And then when I left consulting, I became a professional speaker and advisor, and I'm on till now planes all the time. So it's interesting. I don't know whether it was like I looked at that and said, I like to do something different, whether it's just maybe part of my DNA to begin with. I don't know, but it's interesting to look back at these decisions that we make.
Yeah. Okay. So given that, we're here talking about, goal-free living, I think one of the things I wonder is what your parents taught you about goals, because I know from, reading your bio that you went to Cornell. I went to Berkeley as an undergrad. So you and I both know that you don't do things like that if you are not ambitious enough to set goals. And it's almost a paradox to have done, those kinds of things in your life. So what did they teach you about goals? And what is it in the world that caused you to arrive at this thesis of goal-free living?
Well, I think going back to my parents for a moment, I just remember there's two things that they always said to me. They said, you can do absolutely anything you want to do with your life, but there are two things, and they said this when I was young. There's two things that we expect of you. One, you're going to go to college and graduate. We don't care what college. We don't care what degree. You're just going to get a degree, and you're going to get bar mitzvahed. So those are the only two things that they said I had to do. Now, they wanted me to do well in school, but they weren't. What was nice is they didn't say, you're going to be a doctor, or you're going to do this, you're going to do that, or you have to go here, you have to do. It was like, I really felt like I had that latitude, that freedom to be able to choose and find what's right for me rather than what might have been right for them. And I think that's probably been a huge influence on me in many respects, is I had to make my decisions. They would help me make decisions if I wanted help. But in most cases, I, chose the path that I chose. And I think that probably is why at some level, this whole goal-free living philosophy just, really resonates with me.
Well, okay. So like I said, I think that this kind of flies in the face of, a good amount of the wisdom that we have about personal development. And I think that, people hear the idea of goal-free living. The first thought is, oh, I'm just going to sit around and do nothing all day. I don't have to think about the future. And so what I wonder is, given that you've accomplished what you have, how in the world does something like that even happen if you don't have goals? Because I relate to the whole, sort of, do what you're told thing is Indian culture is very similar to Jewish culture based on, what I've learned from many of the Jewish podcast guests that we've had here. And you mentioned something else, and that was you said that, you decided to do what's best for you. And I think so many people don't do that. They actually let the world around them influence them when it comes to, the things that they make important in their lives, whether it's parents, peers, media, society, whatever it is. So let's talk about that first. Why is it that we're so influenced by the world around us when it comes to what we value in our lives?
Yeah, that was one of the things which I did for research with Goal-Free Living is I did a number of different pieces of research. And one of them was just sort of this quiz, and I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it's like how many people are really living a life of their own design, their own choosing, versus it being heavily influenced by what their parents had done or what society had expected of them or what their family, their spouse expects of them. And in most cases, people were making decisions not based on their own wants, needs, and desires, but rather on external factors. And sometimes there's a need to do that, but I think that what ends up happening is we don't really tap into our God-given abilities. There's certain things that we are just so amazing at that if we don't tap into that, it's a shame.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this idea of you can be, do, or have anything you want, because I think as I was telling you here, I think that idea is very nuanced, and I think it's misguided when people take it literally, because the truth is, you pointed out yourself, you and I were never going to play professional basketball, which is the example that I always come back to. And I had a mentor who was here, and one thing that I really appreciate that he said is that people often think about what's possible, but they don't ever consider what's probable. And as a result, they set really sort of wildly ambitious goals that they're never going to accomplish. And then they're left kind of scratching their heads. And I think that, personal development literature in general is guilty of perpetuating this. And you have a really interesting lens on this that most people don't. So how do you resolve that paradox of, we can be, do, or have anything we want, and then, in reality, we can't?
Well, it was funny. If you didn't mention the basketball example, I would have said the same thing, because there's no way I was destined to be an NBA player. I think, there are things that we can move directionally towards. And I want to just, be clear. When I say goal-free living, I'm not saying you don't have goals. And more accurately, what I believe you should have is aspirations. And aspirations, even though you might think that from a linguistic perspective they're the same, they're actually quite a bit different. So goals are really about overcoming barriers, obstacles, and hindrances. So if you think about football for a moment, the goal is to get to the goal line and get through the 300-pound linebacker to get there. So it's about hard work getting to a destination, whereas aspiration comes from the Latin word for spirit or inspire, and it means to breathe life into. And so when I describe goal-free living, it's not that you don't have goals, and it doesn't mean that you don't, aspire to different things, but it's about having a sense of direction, not a specific destination, and then you meander with purpose. And so It's still about moving forward. It's still about direction. It's still about taking action, but it's not being so myopically and narrowly focused on one particular point.
Mm-hmm. So I love this, because I think that, if there's anything that doing creative work has taught me for 10 years, is it's the path of any creative person or anybody who does anything that just doesn't fall into sort of, conventional jobs or careers. Their path is almost never linear. And what I wonder is, why is it that you make this distinction between a direction and a destination? And I think people set course for a destination really early in life. And, I was writing this new book, and I said, life plans are like, fortune cookies. You have no idea what's going to be inside. So it's kind of ludicrous that we make these really huge life plans. Because I very distinctly remember a conversation I had. I was an intern at Sun Microsystems the summer after my junior year at Berkeley, back in the day when people would actually hire me for a job. And I went to meet with this guy on a sales team because they had this, sales program called the Best of the Best, which was basically a training program for young, undergrads who just got out of college. And if I remember correctly, he was probably 25. He had just had a baby, and he looked at me and he said, I bet you have this huge grand plan for your life, and I'm here to tell you none of it will go according to plan. And God, how right he was, looking back. So I wonder, why do you think that we choose a destination as opposed to a direction?
I think partly it's because society tells us that. The self-help books tell us that. We need to have goals. We need to have ambition. We need to have direction. I mean, so all the things that we're told. But I think also part of it is, because people always ask you, where do you want to be in 5 years? I remember somebody asked me that once. It's like, where do you want to be in 5 years? Like, I haven't a clue. I mean,
I don't know where I'm going to be 5 weeks from now.
Well, exactly. So I don't, and this person was getting frustrated. He's like, come on, you got to have an idea of where you want to be. It's like, I want to be healthy. I want to be happy. I couldn't really articulate much more than that. And this was really sort of at the earliest stages of the Goal-Free Living book coming to fruition. Because I remember talking with somebody and we were having a conversation and they're like, Steve, people are going to try to tell you to have goals, but I picture you as like a frog in a lily pad, and you're just going to hang out there. You're going to sun on that lily pad. And then at some point you're going to decide time to move to the next lily pad. You hop to the next lily pad, and that's going to move you through life. And it's not a straight line, but it's rather that meandering with purpose. That's my term, the meandering with purpose, but that's how I sort of visualize things. And I think what happens is we take comfort. I think goals give us comfort, but then they also give us dissatisfaction. It gives us comfort because we know where we're going. I think we just don't like ambiguity. So saying I'm going to be here in 5 years makes us feel like, okay, I'm on the path towards something. The problem is most people fail to achieve their goals. So then they set another goal and they fail to achieve that. Or if they achieve the goal, well, that goal no longer motivates them. And so we end up in this perpetual cycle of either disappointment or setting another goal, hoping we get that high, as opposed to actually just experiencing life and letting life unfold as we get more information, because we have so little understanding of the world around us. For any person at any point to choose what they think they're going to be doing down the line is based on just such a small percentage of the data that's out.
Subscribe to Ready to Trade, a new 2-part series exploring the opportunities in the UK's e-commerce and healthcare sectors with business leaders in each landscape.
In the UK, we have the infrastructure, we have the connectivity, we also have the culture.
Digital is the way forward, there's no doubt, and your business needs to embrace that opportunity.
Ready to Trade is available to download and is produced by Reuters Plus in partnership with the UK's Department for International Trade.
So last year was kind of a disaster for most of us, to put it lightly. But if there's one gift that the pandemic gave us, it was the time to express our creativity and bring our ideas to life. And no matter what 2021 holds in store, you can spend your time creating something meaningful with one of Skillshare's online classes. They have classes on illustration, graphic design, photography, writing, and so much more. If you're interested in learning a skill, Skillshare probably has a class for it. Former Unmistakable Creative guest Andy Pizza has a course titled Find Your Style, where you can discover your creative DNA and bring that thing that makes you unmistakable to your work. And Skillshare is also super affordable, especially when you compare it to some pricey in-person classes. So without breaking the bank, you can explore the things that interest you most for less than $10 a month. Explore your creativity at Skillshare.com/create and get a free trial of their premium membership. Again, that's Skillshare.com/create. It's not just what you sell that moves the bottom line, it's also how you upgrade the customer experience. And in a crowded marketplace where customers can go wherever they wish with the tap of a button, you need every edge you can get. Introducing Citizens Pay. It's a buy now, pay later solution that lets your shoppers get the upgrades they want right away by paying for them in smaller pieces over time. I recently used Citizens Pay to get a new top-of-the-line ergonomically designed home office chair, and I do my research, and I love the fact that I didn't have to settle for less than the best reviewed chair on the market. I could still fit it into my monthly budget by spreading out the cost over a number of months. And when customers like me get the things they want, so does your business. More purchasing power with your business today means more customer loyalty in the long run. So while your customers enjoy their new 64-inch zillion-pixel TVs, state-of-the-art exercise equipment, and 6-burner stoves to fry, saute, and steam with perfection, you'll be enjoying a nice little boost to your bottom line. Citizens Pay. Get the power to upgrade how you do business.
There.
Yeah, that's the funny thing I think about, when people, start college. I remember we had Stanford professor Tina Seelig here, and she said, she gets two groups of students, those who come in with this very clear idea of exactly what they're going to do with their life and how it's all going to pan out, and those who don't have a clue, and those people are all worried. And she said in the long run, those people actually end up having the most interesting experiences because they explore. And I think the data point thing is really fascinating, because I think that people make these huge decisions without collecting any data points. It's that whole, you can only connect the dots looking backwards thing. But the thing is, you have to collect the dots going forward if you're going to connect the dots. And so I wonder why your way of thinking is not more prevalent in our education system. And I'm curious, like, if you were given an opportunity based on this philosophy to go into the education system and redesign it, would change.
I think part of our challenge is standardized testing. And, if you understand the way that school systems are built, they're really, about turning out people who are actually very similar to fit particular industrial needs in terms of production. And so I think that's, and there's a lot of people who've written about that. And I think what ends up happening is, though, is we lose our creativity. I mean, there's so many studies that have been done in terms of, one study said that we're at our peak of creativity with 98% of us being highly creative at 5 years old, yet by the time we're 25, it's down to 2%. Mm-hmm. So education beats it out of us. And here's what was really, fascinating to me, coming back to something you said earlier, is, so I didn't set out to write a book on goal-free living. That was never my intention. My first book was on corporate innovation, and I wanted my second book to be on personal innovation. And so what I decided to do is I hopped in my car and I drove across the country, 90 days, 11,000 miles, met 150 different people, and my purpose was to interview as many really creative, interesting individuals, very similar to the people you have on your podcast here. And so I wanted just to meet people you wouldn't normally meet, but people who lived life a little differently, creative. And so I came up with a list of about 10 different attributes of these creative individuals. And the book was going to be on how to live a creative life. And when people looked at the list, one of the items on that list was, they didn't have goals, or they had a different relationship to goals. And everybody who would look at the early versions of the book, the draft, would say, this is the key. This is the interesting concept. And so that actually emerged as the overall and overarching theme of the book. So creative people are different.
Well, it's funny you say that. I have a good friend who has been a longtime listener. He's actually been, the guest host here and interviewed me a handful of times, named Matt Monroe. And he has one of the most interesting lives that anybody his age could possibly have. And he said, I don't have goals. He said, I have a worldview, and it's simple. I want to go interesting places, do interesting things, and meet interesting people. And I thought about that, and I said, that is so much more expansive than a goal, because it just opens up so many more possibilities.
Well, absolutely. It's why, and it's sort of in vogue now. But one of the things that when it comes to New Year's Eve, we all set resolutions. Well, resolutions are just goals. I mean, that's all they are. And in most cases, we say, I want to make X number of dollars, or I want to lose this amount of weight, or I want to cut my smoking down to X, or whatever. And so we set very, the SMART goals, those specific measurable goals.
Right.
And my studies show that 92% of the people that we interviewed, and this was actually mathematically validated, 92% of the people had failed in achieving goals at least once, their New Year's resolutions at least once, and there were like 50% of the people had never achieved any of their goals. So that's why I love to set themes. To me, the theme is, what's the word? So like my theme for 2021 is ongoing relationships. How do I build with my clients instead of a transactional one and done type of relationship, which is the nature of a lot of speeches? I really want to take every speech and turning it into an ongoing relationship. How can I make the greatest impact, especially now where people need real results? They don't need inspiration. They need real results. Well, how do I do that? And that's what I do. And it unfolds. And sometimes it's a bad theme and I change my theme. It doesn't have to be yearly, but that whole idea of something broader that encompasses, that allows you to see new opportunities that probably would have been in your blind spots. I think it's so powerful.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up the research. So I wonder, when you contrast the research, what have the studies shown? I mean, outside of the 92%, like what else have you seen with the people who set goals versus the ones who embrace this goal-free living philosophy? And the other thing I wonder is, where have you had resistance to this idea? Because if you look at any company, right, companies are driven by metrics, like objectives and key results, revenue. We measure traffic and subscribers. So in a world that's, driven almost entirely by metrics, as opposed to meaning, how do you resolve that paradox? Like, what is first off, let's just say, what does the research show, and where have you hit points of resistance to this idea?
So I think, first of all, there's a difference between the individual and a corporation. And I'll talk about that distinction. A lot of the work about this was really about how does an individual not set goals. Mm-hmm. Companies are slightly different, but I think some of the concepts still apply, and I'll mention that. So here's, I guess, the fascinating thing is, why do we set goals? If you look at the meta reason for setting a goal, it's to achieve something. Well, the reason you want to achieve something is because you believe it's going to make you happier. And here was the bottom line, fundamental bottom line of my research is the people who achieved their goals, the people who set goals, the people who didn't set goals, the people who didn't achieve their goals, yet they set goals. There was no discernible difference in terms of the level of happiness, except for the people who set goals and didn't achieve their goals. They were the least happy, but setting a goal versus not setting a goal had no difference between their happiness. And if you think about it, what that means is, okay, coming back to my definition of goal, hard work, overcoming obstacles, barriers, hindrances to get to a goal line. Well, if it's not if the whole thing's pleasurable, if you're having a great time playing football and going through the 300-pound linebackers, well, then that's awesome. But a lot of people set their goals in order to have something in the future which they think will make their life better. Yet, we know this is true. We get to that future and it's not what we expected it to be, so we set another goal. And so we're on this perpetual quest for something that we will never achieve. But unfortunately, we believe happiness and satisfaction is going to be in the future, rather than saying, how do I treat life as a game where I can actually enjoy every minute of every day doing the things that I need to do? No. So that's, to me, the most interesting thing when it comes from a personal perspective with the research.
Okay. This flies in the face of so much of what we have been taught about this, from the Brian Tracy's of the world to, whoever it is. Like I told you, that's one of the reasons I wanted to have, Oliver Burkeman here to start the year, because I just felt that he had a much more realist approach to personal development. And I think that what I see when I see so much of the literature that comes out of this material is that it's more of a sort of fantasy approach to this stuff where, people think they can do anything. And we kind of alluded to that. But, so with, so much of this that, basically flies in the face of everything that we've been taught. First off, why do we have sort of, Brian Tracy out there saying that this is the key to success? And then somebody like you comes along, or somebody like Oliver comes along and basically says, yeah, look, this is not, it's going to actually not make you as happy as you think it will. And then, a follow up on that. This is something that I asked Oliver, I know that basically the goal will never make you as happy as you think it will, simply because of hedonic adaptation. And the question I had for Oliver is it even possible to get off the hedonic treadmill?
That's a lot of questions there. So I think the first thing that I just want to say is that I think people, again, I think they set goals because it gives them some level of comfort, and there's a belief that they'll be happy in the future. And I don't want to. When I started down this path, I was treating this as sort of a one-size-fits-all strategy. And actually, what I've discovered is the concept of goal-free living appeals to some people, but doesn't appeal to others. And it actually makes a lot of sense as time has gone on, and I've seen who really does it gravitate towards. Well, I think the reason why people want the goals is because they believe achievement is going to be the key, and that's especially in the US, that's our culture. We're an achievement culture. We need to achieve things. But I think there's people like myself who I'm much more experiential. I would describe myself, even though I'm an engineer and I like process, I really love to just experience life freely. So, if you were to use Myers-Briggs as an example, in Myers-Briggs, I'm a perceiver off the charts, which basically means that instead of liking to plan the work and work the plan, I like things to unfold. Well, goal-free living fits in, I think, very nicely with people who fall into that category. Whereas if you're a person who really gets satisfaction of checking something off of your list, well, then this strategy might not be the right one for you. So I think that's the other mistake that we make is goals are great. goals aren't great. No, it really, context matters. The person matters, and what works for one person may not work for someone else.
Okay, so you're really speaking my language. I mean, it's funny. I think that's the underlying theme of the book that I'm working on. It's going to be a self-published book, but what I keep finding over and over is that context is something that really matters. We actually had a guy named Sam Summers here as a guest. We haven't published his episode yet, but he wrote a book called Situations Matter. And one thing that I have noticed over and over, throughout this entire process of, building Unmistakable Creative, working with, lots of creative people, is that they tend to overlook context.
Yes.
And
I think
so
we do that in general.
And the sort of default assumption is, oh, this, really successful person he basically says they did this and that's how they became successful. So I'll do this. So this is, what I call the outlier bias. It's, and the thing is that by definition, an outlier is an anomaly. So they're not really a good role model for success. Yet I think a big thing that happens is that they're the people that, we write books about. They're the people who give TED Talks. And, I wrote in the book, I said, nobody ever writes a story about the person who busted their ass for years and doesn't amount to shit. And that's part of where this contexting happens. But how do you think that people become more aware of the context when they're thinking about this information?
So I think there's two different pieces. One is, just to come back to the last thing you were talking about there, is I'm always fascinated with survivor bias and its cousin, the undersampling of failure. I love the concept of undersampling of failure, and that's what happens. So, one of the things that we'll talk about is, hey, let's go do this. I mean, one of my books is called Best Practices Are Stupid. And the reason why they're stupid is because almost every single practice that people tell you to do, for every person who claimed it was the cause of their success, there's 1,000 people who will never be able to have a voice. There's 1,000 people who tried exactly that practice and failed to achieve the result. So it's not necessarily a causation. Maybe it's a correlation. Maybe it's a coincidence. And so we're not good at being critical thinkers. And I think that's a really important thing, is to just understand that distinction between causation, correlation, and coincidence. And we tend not to do that. And that leads us then to context, which is there's never a one-size-fits-all strategy. Anybody who tells you, go do this, I would immediately be skeptical of what they say. And, I always say my best advice is to ignore all advice. People are well-meaning, but it doesn't mean that they know you. And especially if you're coming down to an individual, what we need to do is understand what are their wants, their desires, their personalities, their needs. And everybody's going to be different. And that's what we need to recognize, is just how do we get into somebody else's shoes, somebody else's head, to be able to understand their needs so that we can actually speak to what they need rather than what we think they should have.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because you see articles, on places like Medium. So, my friend Ben Hardy, who's been a guest here as well, he wrote this book this blog post that has like 50 million views on it, titled 8 Things That Everybody Should Do Before 8 a.m. And I remember asking him, I said, Ben, I was like, if somebody worked a 13-hour shift at a hospital, there's nothing on this list that they should be doing. The only thing they should do is go to sleep. And I think that's the problem, is we look at this advice and it's not the flaw in the advice, but in our interpretation more often.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I think all advice is well-meaning, and in the right situations, it definitely works. Mm-hmm. But I think, the key is to adapt what someone says, not adopt what someone says. And we're all looking for that simple 7-step blueprint. If I do this and this and this and this, my life's going to be perfect, as opposed to saying, well, this is sort of it's not the map, but it's just sort of the lay of the land. And now I'm going to be able to determine my own path rather than that GPS, which says, take this road and that road. Well, maybe I'm going to take a different path, and maybe I'm going to go to a different destination, but I can at least be informed by all of these different pieces of advice that we get from people.
Yeah. Okay. So there are 2 things that you brought up, which I think makes a perfect segue to what you just mentioned earlier in our conversation. You talked about meandering with a purpose and being comfortable with ambiguity. And I think that is one thing. When I work with people, particularly now, with investors, the one thing I look for is the ability to navigate ambiguity. And I'll give you an example. We hired a community manager named Milena. She's a civil engineer with a PhD. She's like, Srini, I don't know shit about social media or community. I'm like, yeah, you're a civil engineer with a PhD. You're smart and you know how to solve problems. That's all you need to know. But I gave her incredibly ambiguous instructions about what I wanted her to do. I was like, I need you to build a listener referral program, and I don't have a clue how to do it. And it was amazing how rapidly she was able to execute. And to me, I was like, this is the standard by which we should always hire. So how do people, first off, develop that comfort with ambiguity? And the thing is, I think when you think about meander with a purpose, it's almost sort of a contradiction to say meander with a purpose. I get what you mean, but how do people manage that without sort of just wandering aimlessly? Because there are plenty of people who wander and, wander aimlessly to end up only going nowhere.
I think that the key is that when I say meander with purpose, the first part to that, though, is have a sense of direction, not a specific destination. So you need that part before you start meandering. So it's like you have to decide, I'm going to go north, south, east, or west. And maybe you even want to be a little more specific that I want to go southwest. Because then at least you have some guardrails. Because if otherwise you could walk around in circles. So to me, it's always still about taking steps forward. And when you take steps forward, you just want to make sure that you're moving at least directionally correct. And then at some point, you'll figure out, okay, well, the destination I thought I wanted to go to really isn't the destination, but there's something over here that's a little bit further over. So it's more about having a peripheral vision rather than just allowing everything. Because I think what happens is when we set goals, and especially when we set a goal and then we set a plan to achieve that goal, well, now all of a sudden we've got that blueprint, that roadmap that we tend not to meander from, as opposed to saying, well, I want to get, so you talked about social media. Well, is the goal of social media to get more followers? Is the goal of social media to get more engagement? Is the goal of social media actually to help drive more revenues? And if you choose one of those, well, you've now narrowed the possibility of what you could create. So it's getting that right. It's sort of like the Goldilocks principle. You don't want it to be too broad where you can just go anywhere, but you don't want to be so specific that you don't have many options.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about this in the context of companies, because you mentioned earlier that it is a bit different for companies. So in an organization, obviously we are using metrics. Unfortunately, nowadays we're using metrics to measure our personal lives too, which is kind of sad given what social media has done to so many of us. But how does this work in the context of an organization? Because I'm sure if I went to my investors and said, "Hey, we don't have any goals this year," they would probably be like, okay, what are you talking about? But it's funny you mentioned this direction, not destination thing, because if you read Ed Catmull's book, Creativity Inc., he actually talks about that. He specifically says the future is a direction, not a destination.
Well, I think it has to be a direction because strategic planning, as we've known it to be, can't exist anymore. I mean, there's just the pace of change and the unknowns and everything else. So we want to know directionally where we're going to go, but we have to have that nimbleness, that adaptability. My whole work for the past 25 years has been around innovation. And when people ask me to define innovation, to me, it's not about novelty. It's not about, developing something new. It is about adaptability and relevance. That's all that matters. If you're not relevant in the minds of your customers and you're not able to adapt to stay relevant, then you're out of business. That's the only reason why we have innovation. And so we need that nimbleness inside of organizations. And the more rigorous we are, the harder it will be to make those changes. What I will say, though, is that, again, it comes back to the one size fits all. Parts of the business you want to have running like a well-oiled machine, because if you're in the logistics business and you're trying to ship products, well, yes, let's do things a particular way because we know it works. And if a problem pops up, well, we need to have that adaptability to solve the problem. But for most of the cases, we want to be able to handle them as efficiently as we possibly can. But then there's those other situations, whether it's, the way that we're going to start introducing new products in the future, or maybe we want to start making changes in the way we meet shifting customer demands. Well, now we can't use the traditional goal-oriented, metric-driven approach. And I just want to say one thing, because I think this is really important, is goal-free living is not about not having goals. It's actually about changing your relationship to the goal.
Hmm.
And I'll give you just a really super simple example here, which is sales. Most organizations have sales targets. Their salespeople are told, this is how much you need to sell, and this will determine how much compensation you get. So we did an informal study in a retail store a number of years ago, and we decided we were going to tell one group of people they're measured on how much they sold, and another group of people were told, we're not going to measure you on how much you sell. You're going to be evaluated and incentivized around how well you serve customers. And you need to take care of them and give them what they need. And what was fascinating is when we were done, the people who weren't focused on selling, the people who were focused on serving, sold more than the people who had the goals. And so I've worked with a number of companies over the years where they even looked at how do we shift the way we motivate and incentivize sales teams so that they directionally know what they need to do, but it's about the relationship, not about the sale, knowing that the sale comes because of the relationship.
Wow. So one thing I wonder, you mentioned changing the relationship to the goal, which I really appreciated. And I think that when it comes to goals, a lot of us have a huge sort of sense of attachment to our goals. So I wonder how you deal with that aspect of goals when you're changing your relationship to goals. Like, how do you not let whether or not you accomplish the goal define your worth? Because I can tell you, I've had moments where I'm like measuring my self-worth in podcast downloads and book sales. That's a recipe for disaster.
Right. Yeah. So that's the eighth principle of the book is remain detached. And I struggled with that for the longest time because you want what you want. And what I've found is that the people who are able to remain detached from the goal attach them to something else. And so and the analogy that I like to use here is golf. And I'm a terrible golfer. So using golf as an analogy, not a great thing necessarily, but it really works is because I do know there's a principle in golf that you always use, which is you line up. So you're at the ball, you're lining up, you get your feet right, you get your club right, and you look at the pin, you look at where you're trying to go. But then the key is, so that's your goal, to get it into the hole. But when you are swinging the club, if you look at the hole, you will slice the ball and you will never come close to the hole. So you need to attach yourself to something else, which is the ball. In Caddyshack, be the ball. But that's really what you need to do because you need to look at the ball. You need to attach yourself to something else, which is a present moment activity. What's the thing that I can do right now at this moment that's going to do the best? It's going to move me in the right direction. So by focusing on the ball before you swing and only looking at the ball, you'll have to have that trust that it's going to bring you to the hole. So that's to me the key.
I love that because it's so similar to what I tell writers. I'm always like, don't, focus on, how many people read your writing, focus on how many words you've written. Like that's what you can actually control. And I think that that's where we get into trouble is when we try to control what we can't.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. This has been really, really fascinating. I love this entire philosophy because it's just so different. I think that it gives people a different way to sort of think about this and not sort of a stressful sort of, oh God, I'm a horrible person because I can't accomplish my goals, mindset, which I think is just so much healthier and I think will liberate people. What have you seen? You mentioned the sales team, like in people's personal lives, what have you seen as sort of like outcomes that have surprised even them and exceeded their expectations by approaching things this way?
I think the biggest thing that we've seen is that people, you talk about there's impossible goals like being on the basketball team. Well, I think what people realize is the goals that they had weren't the goals they really wanted. And if you live life experientially, if you live life where you're gathering new insights and you're starting to say, well, I like this, but I don't like that. I want to do more of this and I want to do less of that. And you start moving that meandering part, well, you end up in a completely different direction. I've had so many people say to me, where I thought I wanted to be in 5 years would have been miserable. But instead, what I wanted to do is I determined that I actually wanted to do this. Or in some cases, where people thought they wanted to go with their goal was the right goal, but the path they were taking to get there ended up being totally different. Because I think in a lot of cases, most people would say, I don't want to achieve, I want the outcome, but it's going to be so much work. But then when they get really clear as to where they want to go, and then they allow things to unfold, in many cases, they hit the goal, but they took a path that was pleasurable and enjoyable. And so it wasn't even about the goal necessarily, but the goal was, just sort of that thing pulling them forward rather than them having to push.
I love that. Wow. Well, this has been really amazing. I love conversations like this because they just make you think, like it's not like we give people any sort of blueprint, which I appreciate more than you can possibly imagine. So I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews at the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
So I think the thing which makes somebody unmistakable is when they are true to themselves. I really do believe that we're trying to label people. We're trying to shoehorn people. And this is what my parents gave me the gift of, is basically saying you can do whatever you want. You can major in anything you want, but you just have to get a degree. And that freedom really allowed me to choose who I am. And I keep on correcting because I realize, well, I like to do this, but I don't want to do that. And that to me is that really to me makes somebody unmistakable when they're truly tapped into what makes them special, their uniqueness, their differentiator, and they really play to that as much as they possibly can.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story and insights with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, your books, and everything that you're up to?
The easiest thing is to go to steveshapiro.com. You'll find all the books there. And by the way, Goal Free Living is actually like over 15 years old now. So when I wrote this, people were saying, wow, this is maybe a little ahead of its time. And I'm glad that people are now starting to, especially with the pandemic, where things are so uncertain, it really feels like people are becoming much more interested in an approach to life that's based on the fact that life's uncertain. So yeah, just go to my website. You can learn all about me there.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
What's new in podcasting? Here's what we love, courtesy of Acast Recommends.
I'm Vanessa Zoltan.
And I'm Casper Ter Kyle.
And we have just launched a brand new podcast, The Real Question.
Vanessa, you and I met in divinity school, which was a rather unexpected place for us to be.
Yeah, neither of us are religious people, but just because we weren't religious didn't mean that we didn't care about life's quote-unquote big questions, right? How to be good, how to live well.
And sometimes jumping into those big questions is kind of overwhelming. So this podcast is all about finding the seemingly little questions in our lives, because those questions actually lead us to something deeper and more interesting. You might say, the real questions.
So listen to The Real Question on the Acast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast recommends.